What happens when a rising news anchor, at the peak of his career, completely loses control, live on national television? It wasn't a joke, a prank, or a tech issue. It was a full-blown panic attack, watched by millions of people. His heart pounded, his vision blurred, and his voice cracked, all while reading the news. That anchor was Dan Harris. And this is how his journey into mindfulness began, not with a peaceful retreat, but with a breakdown on air. Welcome to Quick Reads, where we break down powerful books into bite-sized, life-changing lessons. This is part 1 of our summary of 10% Happier, a book that proves you don't need to be spiritual, zen, or enlightened to live better. You just need to be open and a little bit curious. Let's get into it. At first glance, Dan Harris had it all. He was young, ambitious, and successful, working as a news correspondent for ABC News, covering everything from wars in the Middle East to presidential elections. On the surface, he was living the dream. But underneath the confident anchor voice and polished image was a man filled with anxiety, insecurity, and self-doubt. The pressure of being in a cutthroat media environment, combined with a constant need to prove himself, was quietly eating away at him. To cope, Dan turned to unhealthy habits. He started using recreational drugs, especially cocaine and ecstasy, convinced he had it under control. It was his way of unwinding after intense assignments. But he failed to see the warning signs until it was too late. Then came the moment that changed everything. It was supposed to be just another segment on Good Morning America. Dan was filling in for a colleague, reading the headlines, but within seconds of going live, he felt it. A wave of fear, shortness of breath, racing heartbeats, and pure panic. He stumbled through his words. His mind went blank, and the panic took over. Millions of viewers watched it happen in real time, and while they might not have realized what was going on, Dan did. He knew something was deeply wrong. This wasn't just nerves. This was his body screaming at him to stop. After the show, he began to reflect. He asked himself, what just happened? Why did this happen? Doctors told him what he already suspected. He'd had a panic attack, likely triggered by stress and drug use. That moment forced him to confront what he'd been avoiding for years, his mental health. It also made him start asking deeper questions. Why was he so restless, even when things were going well? Why did he feel like he was always chasing something, never satisfied? Dan did what most people in his position might do. He started exploring the world of self-help. But he was a skeptic. He hated cliches, empty motivation, and anything that sounded remotely spiritual or woo-woo. Still, he was desperate for answers. He began reading books by Eckhart Tolle, whose teachings focus on silencing the inner voice and living in the present moment. At first, Dan was confused and even irritated. Tolle's ideas felt vague, mystical, and hard to apply. But beneath the abstract language, Dan sensed something real. The idea that the voice in our heads, the constant self-criticism, worry, and replaying of the past, isn't who we really are. This realization opened a door. Dan had always assumed that voice was him, his personality, his drive, but now, he started to wonder, what if that voice is just mental noise? What if I could learn to see it for what it is, and maybe even quiet it down? As part of his job, Dan began interviewing famous spiritual teachers. He met Deepak Chopra, Eckhart Tolle, and other big names in the self-help space. But his skepticism stayed strong. He found many of them vague, evasive, and hard to relate to. Chopra, for example, spoke in poetic but confusing terms about the cosmic consciousness. Tolle would talk for hours without really giving practical advice. Dan wanted concrete answers, not just feel-good phrases. He wasn't looking for enlightenment. He just wanted to feel less anxious, more focused, and in control of his thoughts. Then, by chance, he discovered Jon Kabat-Zinn, a scientist who created a secular, science-backed program for stress reduction using mindfulness meditation. Unlike the other gurus, Kabat-Zinn used data and neuroscience to explain how meditation changes the brain. This was different. For the first time, Dan saw that meditation wasn't about chanting or escaping the real world. It was about facing reality with clarity, and training your mind the same way you train your body at the gym. Here's the key shift Dan experienced during this early stage of his journey. The voice in my head is an asterisk hole. That's Dan's words, not mine, but it hits home. We all have that voice, the one that tells us we're not good enough. That compares us to others. That obsesses over past mistakes or future worries. For Dan, this voice was driving his ambition, but also his anxiety, anger, and panic. By realizing this voice wasn't his identity, but just thoughts, he found a sliver of freedom. This is where the book 10% Happier gets its name. Dan didn't become a monk. He didn't become perfectly peaceful. But he became just a little less reactive, a little calmer, and a little more in control. That's the power of awareness. And that's the beginning of his transformation. Dan Harris was now on a mission. After his panic attack on national TV and realizing that his internal chaos couldn't be fixed with ambition or drugs, he dove headfirst into the self-help world, but with a journalist's mindset, curious, but highly skeptical. He didn't want fluffy promises or spiritual jargon. He wanted practical tools, real answers, something he could actually use in the real world, not on a mountaintop. So, he started by exploring one of the biggest names in modern spirituality, Eckhart Tolle. Meeting Eckhart Tolle. The Power of Now, or The Power of Confusion. Tolle's best-selling book, The Power of Now, claims that most of our suffering comes from living in the past or future, and that true peace only exists in the present moment. For many readers, it's life-changing. For Dan, it was frustrating. Tolle's ideas made some sense. This whole idea that we live so much of our lives caught up in thinking, in our own mental stories, that we miss what's happening right now. But the way he explained it, full of mystical language and abstract metaphors, Dan often found himself thinking, okay, this sounds deep, but what do I actually do with this? Still, something about Tolle's message stuck. This notion that the voice in our heads, our thoughts, judgments, fears, and stories, isn't necessarily who we are. That maybe, just maybe, we don't have to listen to it all the time. But that raised a big question. If we aren't our thoughts, who are we? Deepak Chopra and the Ego Dilemma. Still searching. Dan met Deepak Chopra, another giant in the self-help world. Chopra introduced him to the concept of the ego, the part of ourselves that's always comparing, wanting more, fearing failure, and craving attention. According to Chopra, the ego is a false self. He described the path to happiness as dissolving the ego and reconnecting with the cosmic consciousness, or pure awareness. But again, Dan felt torn. On one hand, he could relate to the idea of ego, the constant inner voice saying, do more, be better, don't mess up. On the other hand, Chopra's language felt vague, spiritual, and hard to grasp. Dan was looking for something grounded, something that worked in a newsroom, not just on a yoga mat. Still, the idea of ego, this relentless, insecure part of the mind, was starting to make more sense. He began to see that much of his suffering came from reacting to this voice without realizing it wasn't him. Enter Buddhism, a practical philosophy, not a religion. Things started to shift when Dan stumbled into Buddhism, not the religion, but the philosophy behind it. What attracted him was how practical it was. Buddhist teachings, especially those of the Dalai Lama and Joseph Goldstein, framed the mind as something you could train, just like a muscle. They didn't talk about miracles or cosmic energies. They talked about the nature of suffering, the root causes of mental stress, and how awareness could change your life without changing your circumstances. At the heart of it all, one practice, mindfulness. Mindfulness, in simple terms, is paying attention to the present moment, on purpose, without judgment. That was it. No robes, no mantras, no chanting, just watching your thoughts and feelings like clouds passing in the sky, without getting caught in the storm. Jon Kabat-Zinn. Mindfulness for skeptics. Then came the real breakthrough. Dan discovered Jon Kabat-Zinn, a scientist who had taken the principles of Buddhist meditation and stripped them of religion and dogma. Kabat-Zinn created something called mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, a completely secular, research-backed approach to mindfulness. Here was someone who spoke Dan's language. Kabat-Zinn described the mind as having an autopilot mode, constantly reacting, worrying, and wandering. And meditation? It was the off switch. A tool to bring you back to the present and give you space between stimulus and response. Suddenly, meditation wasn't about becoming a saint. It was about becoming less of a jerk to yourself and others. It wasn't about blissing out. It was about becoming less reactive, more focused, and slightly happier. For Dan, this was the missing piece. First steps into meditation. Armed with new understanding, Dan decided to try meditation, not the spiritual version, but the simple, science-backed kind. He started small. Sit still. Focus on the breath. When the mind wanders, which it always does, gently bring it back. That's it. At first, it felt pointless, boring. His mind wandered constantly, and he judged himself for doing it wrong. But slowly, something changed. He began to notice the space between thought and reaction, the ability to observe his impulses instead of blindly following them. The voice in his head, the one always shouting, comparing, freaking out, started to lose some of its power. And for the first time, Dan realized, I can respond instead of react. This tiny shift, just noticing his thoughts instead of being controlled by them, felt like a superpower. The 10% happier effect. Dan didn't become a monk. He didn't meditate for hours a day. He didn't achieve enlightenment. But he noticed something subtle and powerful. He was a little calmer, a little clearer, a little less reactive, not blissfully happy, not floating through life, just 10% happier. And that was enough to make a real difference in his work, relationships, and especially in how he handled stress. He realized that the voice in his head didn't have to run the show. And with just a few minutes of mindfulness a day, he could start changing his relationship with it. By the end of this phase, Dan had transformed from a skeptic to a cautious believer, not in magic, but in mindful attention. He discovered that meditation didn't have to be a spiritual practice, it could be a mental workout. A tool for real people with real problems. He wasn't looking for nirvana. He just wanted to be less miserable. And mindfulness delivered. By now, Dan Harris had dipped his toes into the world of meditation. He'd accepted the idea that mindfulness might actually help him manage the chaos in his mind. But understanding the benefits and actually living them? Two very different things. In part 3 of 10% Happier, Dan goes beyond curiosity and enters the uncomfortable world of practice. This is where things get messy and real change begins. Let's dive in. Meditation retreat. A journalist in silence. Dan's next big step was attending a 10-day silent meditation retreat. No phones, no talking, no distractions, just you, your thoughts, and hours of meditation every day. For someone who thrived in high-pressure newsrooms, the idea of sitting still and doing nothing sounded like torture. And in many ways, it was. At the retreat, Dan struggled, his knees hurt, his mind raced, and he judged himself constantly. Old memories surfaced, annoying thoughts looped. He doubted the whole thing. But that discomfort? It was the point. Meditation wasn't about escaping your mind, it was about facing it. Without distraction, learning to sit with the itch instead of scratching it, observing frustration instead of reacting to it. Dan realized something powerful. His inner voice didn't have to control him. He could just watch it, breathe, and let it pass. The ego never stops talking. One major insight Dan gained on retreat was about the ego, not in the arrogant sense, but as that constant mental commentary that judges, compares, and narrates our lives. The ego thrives on more success, more recognition, more approval, and it hates stillness. On retreat, without the noise of work, media, or distractions, Dan saw just how loud his ego had been. It was always trying to prove something or fix something, even while he was meditating. He began to understand that ego wasn't the enemy, it was just a habitual pattern, wired into him by years of chasing success. But mindfulness gave him a tool to notice the ego and create space around it. Instead of identifying with every anxious or self-important thought, he could say, "Oh, there's my ego again," and let it go. This was a huge shift. You don't have to believe everything you think. The big misconception: meditation makes you passive? One of Dan's biggest fears about embracing meditation was that it might make him soft. He worried, if I start becoming mindful and calm, will I lose my edge? Will I stop being ambitious? This fear is common and completely wrong. What Dan learned was that mindfulness didn't kill ambition. It clarified it. Instead of being driven by insecurity, fear of failure, or a need for approval, he could pursue success intentionally, without burning out or hurting people along the way. He didn't lose his drive. He just stopped being dragged around by it. Mindfulness helped him make better decisions, stay calmer under pressure, and become more self-aware, which made him a better journalist, colleague, and person. Working with Joseph Goldstein. Real talk from a real teacher. One of the most important mentors in Dan's journey was Joseph Goldstein, a renowned meditation teacher with a calm presence and a wicked sense of humor. Joseph taught Dan that thoughts are just thoughts. They're not facts. They don't define you. Dan was struck by how practical Joseph was. He didn't pretend that meditation would fix everything. He just said, watch your thoughts, be kind to yourself, practice. That's it. Joseph didn't care if you were a news anchor or a monk. He believed mindfulness worked for everyone, because everyone has a mind that wanders. Through Joseph, Dan learned about key Buddhist principles like impermanence, everything, even emotions, passes, non-self, you are not your thoughts or labels, loving kindness, compassion for yourself and others, even when it's hard. These ideas weren't religious. They were psychological tools for living with less stress and more clarity. Bringing mindfulness into real life. Meditation retreats were helpful, but Dan knew he had to bring these practices into the chaos of everyday life. So he started small, noticing his breath before responding to a rude email, pausing before interrupting in a meeting, recognizing anger rising, and choosing not to act on it. He wasn't perfect. The ego still popped up. Old habits kicked in. But now he had a tool belt, a few seconds of mindfulness here, a quiet breath there. That made a big difference. He also started incorporating loving kindness meditation, which at first felt weird and awkward, repeating phrases like, may I be happy, may you be safe. But over time, it softened him. He found himself judging others less, being less reactive in conflict, feeling more connected, even to people he didn't like. Loving kindness wasn't about being a saint. It was about training the heart. Just like mindfulness trains the mind. Mindfulness at work. The happiness paradox. One of the most surprising things Dan discovered was how mindfulness made him better at his job, not slower or softer, but sharper. When you're fully present, you listen better, you ask better questions, you don't get rattled easily, you respond instead of react. Dan found that even just a few minutes of meditation a day helped him manage pressure, focus in interviews, and stay grounded during live broadcasts. He called it the happiness paradox. The more you let go of needing things to go your way, the more things seem to go your way. Because you're calmer, clearer, more in control. Success didn't come from striving harder. It came from showing up fully. No need to be enlightened. As his journey continued, Dan stayed honest. He wasn't aiming for enlightenment. He wasn't a guru. He still got angry, still got stressed, still messed up. But he'd become 10% happier, and that was huge. He'd found a way to deal with the noise in his head. A way to navigate life with less panic and more perspective. And if someone like him, a skeptical type of news anchor, could benefit from meditation, anyone could. In this phase of the story, Dan didn't become someone new. He just got better at being who he already was. By practicing mindfulness, he learned to tame the ego, stay grounded under pressure, and create space between his thoughts and actions. By this point in Dan Harris' journey, something had changed, not just on the surface, but deep within. He wasn't chasing some mystical transformation. He hadn't escaped stress, ego, or ambition. Instead, he'd learned how to work with them, through small, daily moments of mindfulness that added up to something powerful, a clearer mind, better decisions, and a little more peace. So, how did he make it all stick? How do you take ideas like meditation, mindfulness, and self-awareness, and actually apply them in a busy, modern life? Let's break down the final part of 10% Happier into 3 key themes: practical habits, realistic expectations, and how to keep going even when you suck at it. 1. Build a meditation habit that doesn't suck. Dan is blunt about this. Meditation isn't always fun. Sometimes, it's boring, frustrating, or downright uncomfortable. But that's exactly why it works. It trains your brain to stay in the moment, even when the moment sucks. Dan's routine was simple. Start with just 1 minute. Yes, really, sit down, close your eyes, and focus on your breath. When your mind wanders, and it will, gently bring it back. Don't judge yourself for getting distracted. That's the rep. That's the workout. This is how you build the mindfulness muscle. Dan didn't meditate for hours. He just committed to a few minutes a day. Consistently. And slowly. It changed how he showed up in conversations, at work, and in his own mind. 2. Apply mindfulness off the cushion. The real test of meditation isn't how zen you look while sitting cross-legged. It's how you act when life gets messy. So, Dan started integrating mindfulness into the everyday chaos. Before a stressful meeting, he'd pause for a breath. When his inner critic shouted, "You're going to fail," he'd notice it and keep going. When someone triggered him, he practiced responding instead of snapping. One powerful tool he used was the RAIN technique, a mindfulness strategy taught by Tara Brach. R. Recognize what's happening, like anger or anxiety. Allow it to be there without resisting. I. Investigate why it's showing up. N. Non-identify. Remind yourself, this isn't who I am. It's just a passing experience. It's not about perfection. It's about having a little more space before the reaction takes over. And that space? That's where emotional intelligence, better choices, and personal growth happen. 3. Redefining success. One of the biggest takeaways for Dan, and probably for most of us, is this: success doesn't have to come with burnout. Before meditation, Dan equated success with grinding, proving, performing. It worked, but it was also eating him alive. With mindfulness, he discovered something counterintuitive. You can stay driven without being miserable. You don't lose your edge, you sharpen it. You don't stop caring, you stop catastrophizing. You don't become passive, you become more strategic. Dan stayed ambitious. He still worked hard, but he learned how to pursue goals with intention, not panic. Instead of letting his ego run wild, he started noticing when it took over and choosing a calmer path. 4. The myth of constant calm. Here's where Dan gets brutally honest again. Mindfulness doesn't make you perfect, or even peaceful, all the time. You'll still get annoyed in traffic, snap at people you love, feel anxious before big moments, have days where you don't want to meditate at all. That's normal. Mindfulness isn't about becoming a different person. It's about not being ruled by your inner chaos. When you mess up, you just start again. Every breath is a reset button. Dan calls this idea the most important lesson of the book. You can always begin again. 5. A new relationship with the inner voice. Throughout the book, one theme keeps coming back: the voice in our heads. It never shuts up. It judges, worries, criticizes, and obsesses. And most of us just believe it, without question. Mindfulness taught Dan how to listen without obeying. He stopped identifying so strongly with every thought. He began to treat thoughts like weather, temporary, passing, and not always accurate. This created room for self-compassion, something Dan had never seriously considered before. He realized, beating yourself up doesn't work. It just keeps you stuck. Kindness toward yourself isn't weakness. It's fuel for growth. 6. Why 10% is enough. Dan didn't name the book 100% Enlightened or Totally Transformed. He chose 10% happier on purpose. Because small changes matter. 10% less stress means you yell at your kids less. 10% more focus means you finish work faster. 10% more self-awareness means you avoid that fight with your partner. Is it flashy? No. Is it real? Absolutely. Dan's message is clear. You don't have to be a monk to benefit from mindfulness. You just have to start. Final thoughts. What you can do today. So, after everything, panic attacks, TV meltdowns, ego battles, silent retreats. What's Dan's advice? It's shockingly simple. Just try it. Don't wait to feel ready. Just sit for a minute and breathe. Keep showing up, even when it's boring, especially when it's hard. Drop the drama. Meditation doesn't need incense, chanting, or enlightenment. It just needs you. Let go of being good at it. There's no perfect meditation, there's just practice. Notice small wins, less snapping, more patience, a pause before the freak out. That's the path to 10% happier. Not a new personality, not a spiritual makeover, just small, consistent shifts that change the way you think, feel, and live. And that's the full journey of 10% Happier by Dan Harris. From panic to presence, from ego to awareness, from chasing more to appreciating what's here. If you're stressed, skeptical, or just tired of your own mind running the show, this book reminds us that happiness isn't a finish line. It's a practice, and even 10% is worth it. Dan Harris didn't become a monk. He didn't give up ambition. And he's still a work in progress, just like the rest of us. But with a few minutes of mindfulness each day, he got 10% happier. And that was enough to change everything. So if you've ever felt overwhelmed by your own thoughts, burned out by your goals, or stuck in stress, start small. One breath, 1 minute, 1 moment at a time. Because a calmer, clearer, and more focused version of you is possible, and it starts now. Man in lotus position. If you found this summary helpful, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. What's one thing you'll try from this book today? Thanks for watching Quick Reads, your shortcut to deeper thinking.